Attributes are one of the core concepts for RPG games, and probably you know them as strength, intelligence, constitution, dexterity, luck, and so on. In some games they can be different, but in general they tend to define, they usually define the intrinsic values of an entity, the characteristics that define an entity in certain ways. And they are usually also have a relationship with the statistics. So, for example, if we have a physical attack as a statistic, we may want to define a relationship in between the strength attribute and the physical attack statistic. So, the greater the strength of our entity, the higher the physical attack will be. And this can also extend to other statistics. So, for example, dexterity could influence the dodge chance statistic, or the intelligence attribute could influence the magical power statistic, and so on. We can start by taking a look at how to create the attributes. Like, as always, we can go on Create, SOAP RPG Framework, and select attributes, or we can also use the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-A. We can provide a name. So, for example, here we will be using strength for our first attribute. As for the statistics, they can have optionally a maximum value or a minimum value that by default is 0. And we can define just a few more. So we're also using the shortcut. So, for example, we also want to say constitution, and maybe also intelligence, and we define also dexterity, and finally maybe luck. So these are the most commonly known attributes, but you obviously can define your own. There is no limit to what you can define. Now, as for the statistic, we can also aggregate them together into an attribute set. And so, for example, this could be the standard or the hero, maybe hero attribute set. And now we can just add all of them. For example, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, luck, like this. Very well. So I want to mention now, as I was saying before, the relationship that can be defined in between physical, like in between statistics and attributes. And if we take, for example, the physical attack, we can see that there is this attribute scaling parameter that we can provide that is of type attribute scaling component. And we haven't seen scaling components in general. We will be dealing with them in the scaling formula videos. But we can, for the sake of the tutorial, we can just introduce briefly the attribute scaling component. So, for example, I can put maybe here, for example, scaling components. And I can create here SOAP RPG Framework scaling attribute scaling component, and we can define here physical attack scaling component. And the attribute scaling component allows us to define how a certain value, that in our case will be our physical attack statistic, scales on the values of our attributes. So if we drag and drop our hero attribute set here, we see that we can set the scaling ratios for the various attributes. So for the physical attack, we're interested only in strength, we could say. So if we put 1 here, we are saying that our physical attack will scale linearly along with strength. For each 1 point of strength, our entity will get 1 point of physical attack. And in order to complete the binding, we need to go to our physical attack statistic, and you can see here that there is this attribute scaling parameter, and we can drag and drop our physical attack scaling component here, so that we say, okay, we want our physical attack statistic to scale with the attributes basing on the scalings defined inside this attribute scaling component. So our physical attack will just gain 1 point for each 1 point of strength. If here obviously we define something like 2.5, it means that every single point of strength will be 2.5 physical attack points worth. So it will scale much faster. Or if we want, we can also, for example, set such values to define, okay, we want it to just for every 2 points of strength, we will get 1 point of physical attack. The last thing that we have to mention about attributes in this video is the entity attributes component that we can attach to an entity in order to manage the attributes for that specific entity. And this is working similar to the entity stats component. We can add it by searching entity attributes here. We can click on it and we see that we have some parameters that we can check, we can deal with in order to control the attributes for such an entity. We can start by assigning an attribute set for the fixed based attributes. So we can drag and drop here our hero attribute set, and we see that here we can set the values for our attributes just as we did for the statistic in entity stats. So for example, we can set 10, 9, 10, 2, 2, something like this, for example. One thing that entity attributes has on that instead is not present in entity stats is the attributes point per level. So in many RPGs, when you level up, you are given a certain amount of points, of attributes points, to spend on the various attributes, so that you can like customize the progression of your character, of your hero, as you wish, to make a specific class. For example, like you want maybe to max out the strength, or make an hybrid build, strength and dexterity, or maybe you are building a mage, so you want to spend much more point intelligence, and so on. So if we here put, for example, 1, this will mean that every time we level up, we are given with 1 extra attribute point to spend. So for example, we can set the level, for example, to 2, and we will see that now we have 1 point here to spend on an attribute. And for example, we can assign it here, and this will mean that this strength point we spent will be added to the base attributes. So in the end, our entity currently has 10 plus 1, so 11 strength. But we will come back on this when we will be talking about the progression and classes video tutorial, because we will also see in that video how we can use the base attributes from a class instead of using the fixed base ones. Also here there is the use cache for attributes checkbox. Once again, as for stats, if you are just developing your game, it is best to, if you leave this unchecked, because it makes debugging easier, and this should be checked only when you are actually moving to a production build in the end. This is all for the attributes for now. As I said, we will just be coming back on the progression and classes video tutorial for talking more about how to retrieve attributes from a class.